And so again, this was recorded February 28th, 2019. And it was very shortly after I had talked to JayDyer about theology things. And so I did want Ray's take on theology because Jay's information had stimulated my mind. And I think 2019 was not a great year for me, or 2018 was not a great year. And so I was kind of like coming out of a hole in 2019. And I appreciate Jay because he stimulated my thinking in a way that hadn't been done previously. And so I got Ray on the phone and we talked about a bunch of different stuff about like process theology and Ray's view of theology and like Jay's more logical approach to approaching theology and things like that. And then we talked about just a bunch of different stuff, the CIA, hair loss, conspiracy, moon landing stuff, etc. And I hope you enjoy it. And one other thing before I get out of here, I wanted to mention that more than halfway down, he said, but I just like to be as extreme as possible. And I just want to overemphasize that he kind of laughed after that. He was kind of joking. I think there was some seriousness in it, but also joking. And so if you had just read that line, you might think he had said it with a straight face or something, but he really didn't. So I hope you guys enjoy it. I have one more that I will release at some point, but I'm just doing these things very slowly. And the last thing is when I released the first one, said I was tarnishing Ray's legacy by releasing these. And this is nothing that we haven't talked about, like the Generative Energy podcast. So this is all probably review for a lot of people, but I'm just doing this in an effort because I don't like having Ray's information to myself. And my goal is to have everything out there. And Ray wasn't secretive with this stuff if you had asked him via email. So I hope you guys enjoy it. Appreciate you guys. Take care. Peace out.
Just your thoughts on anti-conspiracy culture. That word is just in the vernacular and it's used so liberally against people that go outside of the mainstream. And even if there are things like MK Ultra or Gladio or Paperclip or a Phoenix Program or Mockingbird or Northwoods, people are completely oblivious to these things. And they tend to think of the CIA as a social service organization or something like that. So it's just, there's a strong resistance to it. And I'm curious on your thoughts of how that resistance was like constructed.
Well, really conspiracy, if you want to call it that, is just another way to speak about the world of geopolitics and espionage and the darker aspects of human social interactions. So if we understand the term to mean that, then obviously conspiracy exists. Governments conspire, corporations conspire, individuals conspire, cartels conspire. It's really kind of inane and lowbrow to not believe that conspiracies exist in the world. It's just really coming from a place of extreme ignorance. But we know as well that during the JFK hearings that the CIA weaponized the term to be something of a pejorative, a way to easily, through false association, basically discount anybody who challenges any kind of official narrative. But if you've studied things like PR, if you've studied things like the history of the Inquisition, if you've studied the history of the way propaganda works, then you know that elites have always operated to control narratives. This wasn't something that began with Mockingbird or anything like that. It's always existed. And you can go back to Renaissance, medieval, ancient world, doesn't matter whether you're talking about Machiavelli in his book, Art of War. He talks a lot about the ways to use psychological warfare, psyops, et cetera, in warfare to basically control people's thoughts, control their mind. In other words, the way that they should accept the narratives of why the battle's being fought, this kind of stuff. So that kind of gives rise to, everybody's familiar with The Prince, I'm sure too, gives rise to modern psychological warfare, modern propaganda, modern narrative construction, I guess. And that goes again back to the ancient world. The elites that ran the ancient empires, they knew this stuff too. Maybe not as scientifically sophisticated as we do in the modern world after World War I and World War II and the Cold War, but they had the basics of this down. And so a lot of the secret societies of the ancient world, just from a practical standpoint, the mysteries I mean, they certainly had a religious element to them, but a lot of those mysteries had to do with initiating people into the ways of ruling man. And that's essentially what those societies' functions do, was to rule and govern and control mankind. If we fast forward to today, the simple answer to your question is, what is the CIA? Well, the CIA is just the private army of the bankers. That's, I think it was Servando Gonzalez in his book, Psychological Warfare in the New World Order, which is not a conspiracy text. He's a intelligence analyst. And I think he coined that phrase accurately as a way to describe what the CIA is. It's not a means of protecting and saving the free world. It's not an organization dedicated to these lofty, high-sounding goals. A lot of people who are recruited into it may believe that, and on the basis of patriotism, they're manipulated into thinking this. The same with other countries too. I'm not just saying this is the CIA, but most of the modern governments in the world today are atheistic. So you're essentially just serving some private corporate interest that you don't know about. And it's no different from the origins of the OSS and the CIA. They come out of essentially the Rockefeller family and their power and influence, and other big bloodline families, big banking families, and a lot of British elites. That's actually who set up the CIA, was British intelligence, working with Bill Donovan and others in the U.S. to establish an intelligence agency. But again, that had predecessors as well, back to World War I, and previously intelligence, which kind of makes the most sense, would be conducted by the military. But what you have with the OSS and the CIA is the conducting of intelligence by private networks set up by really wealthy families. So that model is what dominates the world today. And when you understand that, you can understand how it's pretty much a centralized control structure. So there are thousands of people that work for the CIA, but many of them are compartmentalized. They don't know the bigger picture. Because if you listen to my Quigley talks, I think it was the case that that book was essentially given to CIA handlers. So people who were out in the field, who were somewhat veteran to tradecraft, knew about what was really going on. And perhaps a lot of the people they were handling, they didn't know geopolitics. They didn't know the big picture. They didn't know that there was a plan on behalf of the Atlanticist power bloc to, establish a world government, this kind of stuff. All they knew was what they were fighting in terms of the Cold War or World War II or whatever. So dialectics is a big part of it, but the CIA is a machine to create culture. It's a machine to control narratives in the media. It's a machine to stage coups in other countries. They are essentially, again, the busy bees of the bankers.
You kind of answered it, but just to get it out of the way, the most common retort to any kind of thought on so-called conspiracy is like, oh, well, that would take too many people to keep their mouths shut. So just to reiterate, you're talking about compartmentalization, just not everybody knowing what exactly is going on. Like I think the Manhattan Project had like 130,000 people or something work on it?
No, it was a few thousand people on the Manhattan Project, and the information was completely compartmentalized. And so, yeah, I mean, that's always been a classic example of something that they were able to keep secret for a long time. Now, eventually, of course, the knowledge got out, but for many years, people didn't know about it. And even the thousands of people working there didn't know the whole picture. So, compartmentalization of knowledge is something that's classic. It's classic to governments. It's classic to secret societies. And it's classic to intelligence agencies and the military. That's how the whole thing functions.
Something you mentioned that I really liked, that you said that the culture was trying to separate people from their instincts. And part of this was relying on expert culture. So just kind of handing the person's own autonomy off to a so-called expert, whether it be a scientist, a doctor, a school teacher.
Yeah, the idea of the technocratic state, I've covered this in a lot of talks. I do a series of talks on books written by the globalists called the Globalist Book Series, aptly named. And I cover everybody from Brzezinski to H.G. Wells to Bertrand Russell to Arthur Kessler to modern guys like Jacques Attali. So yeah, there was a chapter, the middle chapter in Quigley's book, Tragedy and Hope, is about the rise of the managerial society. And he says that the government of the future will be under the so-called scientific expert. So that is the essence of technocracy, is ruled by scientific expertise, supposedly, a managerial society. And so a big part of that, yes, is the engineering and shifting of man in terms of his self-perception. Who does man see man as, right? Changing images of man and so forth, shifting it away from the ideas of self-sufficiency and that kind of stuff. Surely, there's no doubt about that, towards an unbalanced notion of the collective. And if you think about somebody like Huxley's very clear about this in his perennial philosophy, that the worldview in terms of globalism for the future, in terms of religion, will be perennialism. It'll be basically a melding and blending of all the religions into one. So there'll be a collectivization in the religious sphere that will mirror the collectivization in the social governmental sphere that will mirror the collectivization in the economic sphere. So that's pretty clearly the basis for the coming global government. And what you describe there is, in essence, technocracy, ruled by managers.
The false dialectics, shifting people to like these two sides and then a WWE of having them compete against each other. And the oligarchy transcends the political sandbox. And
Right.
so I'm sure you've talked about it to death. I apologize. But the intellectual
okay.
dark web, them being this cream of the crop of intellectuals.
Sure, this is an old trick to, so-called intellectuals have been propped up for a long time. 10 years ago, it was the new atheists, right? It was Bill Nye and Neil deGrasse Tyson and other clowns, Richard Dawkins, who are propped up as the so-called experts, the so-called scientific elite. Now that's kind of evolved into a new crop, like you said, the intellectual so-called dark web, who are, just the phony anti-establishment people. JBP.
JBP and Carl Jung. I don't know if you've heard of him, but I have a master's degree in Carl Jung, and repeating everything he said as if I was a genius.
Yeah, I mean, if you've read Carl Jung, and I've read Carl Jung, and I think he's interesting, he's insightful. I don't totally discount reading Carl Jung and archetypes, but he's also can be very dangerous, and you have to kind of guard yourself because it can really turn into in my view, a weird Gnostic type of thing. So, but yeah, the idea of propping up so-called scientists, that actually goes back like 100 years. They were doing that with, I heard some interesting arguments about people who were propped up 100 years ago. And I have to give Alan Watt credit for that because he called my attention to that. And it makes perfect sense again with propaganda. So, one of the things that the CIA and the OSS and these different groups have studied is culture. And as I said earlier, culture creation, that's a big part of how the system works because you don't influence people primarily through the news. You do a certain segment of the population, but you influence a lot more people through music and movies, pop culture. So that's crucial to the system. That's a big part of, my two books, Esoteric Hollywood 1 and 2. And I think when we look at it from that vantage point, we can again begin to see how unified the program is. So you asked about dialectics. Yeah, I mean, politics, Quigley says, for 100 years has essentially been a dialectical game played by people who are much higher up than the governmental class. The governmental class is elected by the people to serve the elite. And then they learn that as they learn the system. I mean, in one sense, it's simple, but in another sense, it's complex. Because the scams that are run, like the big monetary banking scams, shadow banking, all that kind of stuff is very complex. So the average Joe doesn't get it. The average politician doesn't get it. But the people at the top get it. And they make it very clear to the people who come into the world of politics that, you don't serve the people, you serve us. And that should be pretty common sense, right? I mean, who do you think has more power in America? David Rockefeller and his family with, billions of dollars and who knows how much in assets, or, somebody like Nancy Pelosi. I mean, Nancy Pelosi has a lot of money, but, I mean, if you watch those old clips of Bill Clinton when he was elected, who does he think? I'd like to thank David Rockefeller for helping my campaign and putting me here. He goes to the trilateral CFR meetings and he thanks David Rockefeller.
Speaking of, I saw that you posted a photo of Jordan Peterson at the Trilateral Commission, which I thought was extremely revealing. But something I wanted to touch on was that I think when you talk about oligarchy or the genocidal oligarchy, people try to relate that to experiences they've had with authority figures, and they don't see it as being plausible that people could be that bad or people could have a headspace that's so demented. I don't know. What do you think about that?
It is a different mindset. And I mean, we see this even if you're familiar with the British class system, for example. The class system in Britain was based around a rigid caste that if you're familiar with the Hindu caste system, you can see why the British had such an interest and a fascination for, India, right? Which is one of their colonized states, you know, India's caste system makes perfect sense with this sort of Luciferian social Darwinism view of the British oligarchy. I mean, it's not an accident that the British elite gave us Darwinism. Darwinism isn't just a so-called scientific philosophy. It's an actual worldview, a grand narrative, mystical worldview about the elite, basically. And of course, the British upper caste has seen fit to deem themselves the top of this monkey pyramid, and that, in their mind, through social Darwinism, gives them the right to rule and to essentially put into effect the extreme dysgenics views that they have, and to basically do whatever it takes to ensure that the masses of people are either dead, sterilized, or turned into slugs and zombies and social justice zombies, maniacs, basically. And so the irony, I guess, about somebody like Jordan Peterson would be that the classical liberal worldview that he espouses is essentially 100% synonymous with the actual philosophy of the ruling elite, which is social Darwinism. And if you paid attention to like Box Day's critiques of Jordan Peterson, he's caught on to that. He's pointed out how Peterson's modus operandi is essentially use people to get to the top. And that's what other people are there for, is for you to get to the top, because it's a lobster totem pole of climbing to the top of a pile of lobsters or something. I don't know what his whole lobster thing is, but I think he just tried to pick some creature to be his like marketing gimmick, like a little mascot, like a
I'm Jordan the Lobster. I'm the mascot for JBP.
Anyway, yeah, I mean, I think one of the unique aspects about what I do and my approach is that I go after Darwinism. I don't believe Darwinism. I'm very critical of evolutionary theory. That's not to say that there's not adaptation of species. There are. But the classical Darwinian and the neo-Darwinian approaches go far beyond claims of life science. They actually verge over very clearly into the realms of religion and metaphysics and grand narrative claims. And when you start making grand narrative claims, you're no longer in the sphere of empirical science. You're in the sphere of holistic narratives and religion for mankind. So that's why the approach I have is very different from Jordan Peterson. It's very different from a lot of the people in the alt media. A lot of people in alternative media will never ever question Darwinism, and we do at Jay's Analysis, and I think that's a big part because as I read through the globalist books, and I think we've gone through about 15, 16, 17 or so of them now, there are a few unifying factors amongst all the globalists for the last 100 years, and one of those is Darwinism. You have to believe Darwinism. It's a dogma. Others would be things like depopulation, technocratic control, unified, world currency, this kind of stuff, breaking down of borders and nation states. Those are all aspects of the global system that all of the global elite have had in common for the last 100 years. And one of those is Darwinism. And it's kind of amazing to me how few people who claim to, be against the New World Order, against globalism or whatever, they don't talk about this. They don't ever question Darwinism because I guess everybody thinks it's just kind of a given, but it's not. And when you really start delving into evolutionary theory and its claims, you realize, well, this is just repackaged from ancient Hinduism, and it's not really that big of a breakthrough, and it has all these problems, and it's pretty goofy if you start thinking about it. Because, for example, if you start looking at how bodily systems within any organism, or any complex organism, I should say, all of those systems are holistic. For example, this is a very powerful critique that David Berlinski has made, and he points out that you can't have the evolution of one, say, a gill or an eye or something like this, without the holistic functioning of the other systems, right? So in other words, like an eye that requires tissue, that requires blood, requires a heart. So one of the errors of the classical Darwinists was to think that these things just kind of start emerging, from the species, on its own or whatever. But that really doesn't work with the way we understand the physiognomy of organisms now, given the complexity of those organisms, especially. The eye is amazingly complex. It takes all of these other processes working in harmony, right, to achieve a kind of stasis, so that the eye doesn't just spurt tears out all the time, so that your eye doesn't just dry up or something. Like, it takes this whole sort of homeostasis going on at once, and that really makes no sense with a sort of chaotic, blind process. But anyway, I didn't want to going off into all that. I'm just making the point that we start to see when we look into the actual philosophy and worldview of it, which I didn't for a long time. I didn't really have any set opinion on evolution per se until about the last 5 years. I started digging more and more and more into it. And the more I dug into it, the more skeptical I became. And then as a result, I started noticing that, nobody else really, you have some people who will talk about social Darwinism, and that is the philosophy of the ruling elite. And that blends very well, of course, with transhumanism and Luciferianism. But nobody really goes after the evolutionary presuppositions, but I do.
When I was first watching your talks on YouTube, when you mentioned you were Christian Orthodox, it kind of threw me for a loop. But it was interesting because I think there's purpose. I don't think everything's random. Mm-hmm. So I liked hearing you talk about it. And in the argument with JF, I understood like 1% of it. I'm like a philosophy idiot. But I thought what you were saying was making more and more sense, like when I would listen to it over and over again. So like the universe has telos and purpose, and making universal truth claims presupposes logic or intelligence.
Correct.
Was that?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the basic argument there, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then that tying into Aristotle and then the West being kind of infiltrated with Platonism, is that correct?
From the Orthodox vantage point, Aristotle and Plato are both problematic, but they're also insightful. So I've tried to strike a balance for a long time, and humans are creatures of extremes, so we tend to adopt a thing and go full bore with it without thinking in terms of balance. So orthodoxy is neither Aristotelian nor Platonic, and certainly when it comes to any of the philosophers, what I tend to say is that they all have insights and they all have errors, and it's kind of on a continuum. So somebody like Marx might even have some insights, but he's certainly far worse of a philosopher than somebody like, I don't know, maybe Heidegger or somebody. They would certainly be better. But from the vantage point of Orthodox theology, we wouldn't necessarily side with either Plato or Aristotle, because the problems in either one of those systems ultimately from any of the Greeks or any of the Far Eastern philosophies would essentially be the same. They would boil down to the same types of problems, because systems of thought, worldviews, they can kind of be boiled down to starting points and the implications of those starting points. So if you see me in a debate, what I'm always doing is that I'm looking at my worldview, its starting point and its implications, and then I'm doing the same thing with the other guy's worldview. So I'm looking at what he says and what he assumes, and then I'm looking at whether the things that he later says match up to the things that he assumes. And a lot of times people aren't really aware of what they're assuming. So this is called presuppositional apologetics, or what's known as the transcendental argument for God. So that I'm a big proponent of that. So when you see me in debates, particularly with the atheists, that's what you're seeing me do. Is I'm basically, like you said, pointing out that the worldview of the atheist, the materialist, the nihilist like JF is not like he thinks it is. The way that I prove it is by pointing out that he himself doesn't actually live according to his own presuppositions and assumptions. So he'll, on the one hand, make truth claims, and then a minute later, he will deny the possibility of truth claims. It's that simple.
There's a book, you might have heard of it, but it's by Carl C. Lindgren called Cold War in Biology. And he details, I think he calls them like vitalists versus the genetic determinists, and how a normal person might think the best evidence wins the debate. But no, it's like more bureaucratic things. And a lot of the atheistic arguments, like the things that JF were saying, were very in line with him eating his cantaloupe and just being a genetically determined machine, which just my layman studying of physiology just doesn't really jive with that.
Yeah, but I mean, and I'm not discounting that type of approach, but you can just, I think, easily refute that by pointing out what's called the naturalist fallacy or the determinist fallacy, which is to say that JF wants credit for writing his book, then he's assuming and acting as if he is a rational, conscious agent who has a self, right? And in other words, if determinism is true and you're a completely determined biological being, then you haven't actually learned that determinism is true. You're just going through some determined process.
And that whole idea that we're not in control and you can't really do anything to change your situation just serves the oligarchy perfectly.
Oh, absolutely. And that's part of social Darwinism. You're just part of this vast machinery. And if you look out in nature, you see that death is just as much a part of, quote, nature as life is. Therefore, why not deify these two seemingly equal processes in nature? That's why natural law theory itself doesn't work. If I look out in nature, I see death is just as powerful a force, maybe even more powerful than life. Therefore, why not actually just serve, quote, death? I mean, that's kind of the Luciferian ideology, right? And if that's the case, then we're at the position where Kessler and Bertrand Russell say, and Jonas Salk say, that we should engineer death. Why not become the priests of death and engineer and use death to the advantage of the species, namely ourselves, right? The elite. That's their mindset. That's what they literally say. So to be consistent with that worldview actually just leads to the Luciferian Gnostic type of view. And the only position that critiques that is a position that critiques Darwinism and critiques so-called natural law theory and is Orthodox Christianity. To me, that's the only two options. You're either a Luciferian who believes that death is just as good and natural as life, and why not eat your enemies or kill your enemies, as opposed to Orthodox Christianity, which says reality has a beginning, middle, and an end. Life has meaning. There is objective right and wrong. There's objective truth and false. And, there is a spiritual battle going on.
Something I enjoyed about the conversation with Adam Kokesh, he was talking about the non-aggression principle or something. You're like, well, why should I accept that? Nothing. I've never really thought about questioning people making the universal truth claims. Like, I'm glad you put a word.
Yeah, universal truth claims and ethical claims go together and they can't be disentangled. That's the point I was trying to make to ask yourself in the vegan gains debate, which he didn't want to go down that route because he knows it's right. I don't want to go down there. It's orthogonal. Because he knows that metaethics is assumed, right, in any kind of ethical argumentation. And metaethical claims assume metaphysical claims, and they also assume epistemological claims. So, yeah, you can never separate these two. I think that's one of the strongest points in presuppositional argumentation and thought. Again, logically forces a person to be more consistent. So, a lot of times you'll notice people in discourse and debate in different ideologies, they'll make claims, but they don't really have a basis for why one should or should not do things. So, yeah, exactly. Why should I accept the non-aggression principle, especially if I look out at nature and I see nature's got a lot of aggression going on. I mean, there's a lot of predator-prey going on in the natural world. And the Luciferians have simply been more consistent in the sense that they say, yeah, exactly. Nature is a apex predator dominance hierarchy. Therefore, why not just be consistent with that and crush your enemies, rise to the top, become one with your zip drive.
I think you had said in a previous interview that you didn't think necessarily that things were finished and that life was a participatory process. And that I don't know very much about it, but is that anything similar to process theology?
Not really. I mean, process philosophy could be traced to Alfred North Whitehead and Hegel. And for Orthodox Christianity, there's really neither one of them are really that useful per se. I mean, again, all philosophers can be insightful. Hegel has insights, but the danger is always the temptation to try to take one of those systems and then so-called Christianize it. I mean, this is what Hegel did with his version of God or version of the Trinity. It's really just his own philosophy using the language and garb of Christianity. Process philosophy is essentially part of the problem of dialectics. And whether it's Hegel or Marx or Whitehead, one of the things that we see as the problem of philosophy in the West all the way back to Plato is dialectics. And dialectics means different things in different contexts. Sometimes dialectics just means the process of rational argumentation and engagement. And in that sense, there's nothing wrong with dialectics, right? You and I are having a dialectical exchange here. Nothing wrong with that. And then we are, in a sense, converging through this discussion through the assumption of reason and logic, ratiocination or whatever, towards hopefully attaining better knowledge, better understandings. So in that sense, Hegel was right that process goes on. The problem with dialectics in a metaphysical sense, and that's what we reject, is the idea that there are absolutized forces, you could say, within nature or within time, within history, within governments, within political movements, whatever, principles within creation that are in complete battle and tension. So dialectical tensions, and for example, if you looked at Far Eastern religions, that's kind of their bases, right? They look at night and day, male and female, and they recognize that there are these contraries, these oppositional forces. And what they do is they make a metaphysical leap from that. And they said, well, then all of reality must then be dialectical tension between competing forces, and the solution must be that all things have to return to a kind of ultimate unity. So, for example, in all the Far Eastern religions, there's a tendency to see the problem of man's problem or whatever, the world's problem, the location of evil is in particularity and difference, distinctions, right? So that they quite literally identify that as man's problem. And because Plato, who is, again, sort of the father of Western philosophy, because Plato learned his thought from the Far East, and he talks about that in the Timaeus. He got his doctrines from Egypt, and Egypt got their doctrines from probably ancient, Indo-Aryan societies or whatever. And, Chinese and Far Eastern philosophy, they all kind of have some common origin in these ideas of the absolute being this kind of impersonal beyond, right? In the Greek, it's called apeiron, holy other. So in other words, the idea became in the West that, and this is again in Plato, that all things have to get back to this great unity, because man's problem, humanity's problem, the universe's problem is that there's distinctions between things. But of course, that's not the problem. So essentially, and this is what makes Orthodox Christianity unique, is that it is opposed to dialectics. It rejects the ideas of dialectics in nature. I mean, certainly we see oppositions in nature. Day is distinct from night, but day and night are not metaphysically at war with one another. And they're not, and male and female are not metaphysically at war with one another. We believe distinctions are fine. If God created us, then he created us the way we are, and there's nothing wrong with having distinctions. So we have a different theodicy, a different doctrine of where and what evil is, what man's problem is. And that's because we have, again, a different worldview and a different philosophical starting point for how we do things. There's a great debate between one of the perennialists, Fritjof Schuon, and he would kind of be Carl Jung is kind of in the category of the perennialists. So he would, this would kind of be a direct influence on somebody like Peterson. I don't know if Peterson's read the perennialists, but if you look at somebody like Fritjof Schuon, he had a debate with Philip Sherrard, who at the time was arguing the basic Orthodox principle on this. And Schuon was kind of saying, look, all the religions have this same skeletal structure, and therefore they're all just pointing to an absolute that we can't encompass or name. And then it's impersonal. And once we personalize God or the absolute, what happens is that we cut him off or it off from its manifestation in all the other religions, right? So in other words, if you say that one religion is true and it's the, God chosen embodiment within history, then you have delineated and limited this deity. In other words, the assumption on the part of somebody like Schuon was that there's a dialectic between the possibility of God having anything to do with time and space and God considered in himself, right? So this is the same problem, again, of all the Eastern religions. The Far Eastern religions all have this same assumption of ultimate reality being impersonal, just being some generic force. And what Sherrard argued in contrast to that was that is self-refuting. So essentially he gave a transcendental argument against Schuon and argued that if all of the world religions were all the same and they're all just kind of window dressing for this absolute impersonal force, you couldn't know that. It would be impossible for you to come to that conclusion because you came to these conclusions from within time and space, which are all illusory, you see. All the distinctions within time and space are illusory. You are illusory. Your thoughts are illusory. So it boils down into foolishness. And that's why, again, the transcendental argument is so powerful, is that it's useful not just for the atheist, but also for the pseudo-religious perennialist or syncretist who thinks that, the kind of New Age view, all the religions are just simply window dressing for the same so-called truth. But again, it's not really a truth if it requires you coming to learn it within time and space. And so ultimately, it's self-refuting in the exact same way as the claims of JF were self-refuting in our debate.
Does dialectics relate to relativism, which relates to oligarchy and like things like what you turned me on to, the Jaffe Barrelson memo and things like that, just like the total chaotic destruction of the culture in the West?
Sure. I mean, what we're witnessing in the West is the result of a long ideological train of thought. And I don't mean to make it purely ideological. Obviously, there were powerful banking families and forces involved in the promotion of a lot of ideas. But just considered from the vantage point of ideological succession, you have, from Plato, the introduction of dialectical philosophy in its metaphysical sense, which is continued into Aristotle, continued into their students, the Middle Platonists, the Neoplatonists. This is encountered and battled with by the church fathers in the first 1,000 years of the church. You have 8 consecutive ecumenical councils from Nicaea in 325 all the way up to the last ecumenical council in the 9th century, in the sense of a unified Western and Eastern church before the split of Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. But prior to that, you have this unified battle with dialectics and Hellenism. And in fact, the church fathers in those councils actually make this very clear. Many times over, they talk about battling the dialecticians and the dialectical philosophy of people like Origen or Celsus or Arius or Nestorius or any of the early heretics. They're all sort of coming with these philosophical presuppositions. So following through up into the Middle Ages, what you get in the West is the rise, of course, of the papacy and the adoption of a lot of different philosophical presuppositions in medieval scholasticism that give birth to the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution. And you can very clearly trace this ideological trek from point A to point B to point C to point D. I mean, it really does follow in kind of a domino succession from one ideology to the next. And what you get is essentially the insertion of dialectics into the totality of Western thought. Now, that's not to say that, ancient societies or any societies have been perfectly free from the problem of dialectics. I mean, in our view, dialectics entered when the fall happened. When Adam and Eve transgressed, they entered into this state where they were prone to setting up dialectical tensions, right? Anyway, so this leads to, in the modern world, the rise of the technocracy, which has perfected, I guess you could say, the technique of manipulating dialectics in the sociological sphere. So this is a little different from what I was talking about, was more, philosophic and metaphysical and ontological. This is more so in what you're talking about. It's the same kind of principles. And of course, metaphysics and ontology, it certainly reflects into and impacts the sociological sphere. But yes, there is a technique that people who have studied Hegel, you would know how to set groups off against one another. And you don't even have to understand Hegel. I mean, Caesar understood this a long time ago when he wrote the Gallican Wars. He talked about how he could rile one tribe up against another tribe. I mean, this is just kind of basic trickery. So it doesn't require knowledge of like the mysteries of, Plato or, Hegel's unreadable treatises. It's just, if you know basic con man tactics, you could pull off some of that stuff. But the global elite do it at a bigger scale than the local con man does. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. It's definitely a lot to take in, but I think you do a really great job breaking it down. One thing I did want to touch on, and you do break it down very well, is the depopulation strategy and some of the schemes that they have, basically, that were documented in the Jaffe-Barrelson memo that you turned me on to. But things like restructuring of the family, postpone or avoid marriage, alter the image of ideal family size, compulsory education of children, increase homosexuality, educate for family limitation, fertility control agents in the water supply, encourage women to work. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, if you understand that, you understand the overall game plan. I mean, that's kind of the essence of it. I mentioned earlier when we started the talk, I was talking about the rough outline of the things that all the globalists agree on. And you can go back 100 years ago all the way up to now. And there are a few basics that nobody disagrees on. So if you're going to be in the club of the 6,000 managerial class that run the planet, these are the kind of basics that you can't disagree on. And one of those is depopulation. The other one is Darwinism. The other one is a unified economic plan for the globe and technocracy. Right. So all those things are the kind of the creed, you could say, of the globalists. If you wrote a globalist creed, you could come up with 4 or 5 things that every one of them agrees on. Now, they might disagree on the best tactics to get to that end goal, or what to do in Syria, or what to do in this place or that place. But typically, in the big picture scheme, there's no disagreements. You might have globalists who prefer capitalism, and you might have globalists that prefer outright socialism and communism. But either way, it doesn't matter, because they are both global in their perspective, and they're both based on atheism and materialism. Both socialism and capitalism are materialistic presuppositions. And that's another thing that I focus on a lot that a lot of people don't. A lot of people choose, I'm going to be a libertarian and anarcho, whatever, capitalist. No, I'm going to side with this, this sort of collective socialism or whatever. I'm going to be a third position fascist or whatever. I don't take any of those systems because I think that the last 300 years demonstrates that all the systems of the 20th century were essentially the result of consecutive revolutions. And those consecutive revolutions were verifiably started by Freemasons and people in secret societies who wanted to enact a revolutionary program for the entire world. So anyway, yes, if you understand the basics of where we're going, it's not that difficult. You want a unified monetary system, a unified technocratic AI structure to basically run everything on its own, and transhumanism and depopulation. That's everything.
And just some of the people that you've mentioned in your lectures: Walter Lippmann, Jonas Salk, John Holdren, Zbigniew Brzezinski. And the crazy part is they're telling you the plan, like in their books, but it never penetrates the public consciousness of what's going on.
One of the reasons that it doesn't project into the public consciousness is, well, there's multiple reasons, but, toxic diet, toxic chemicals, toxic culture, that's all a big part of it. The education system is brainwashing. Certainly that's all part of it. Media lies. But people have also been kept from learning basic critical thinking. They've intentionally not been taught that in school, because if you learn basic critical thinking, you can suss out, truthhoods from falsehoods and contradictions. So that's very important. And instead, people are basically buy into the identification of some team, Democrat, Republican, or whatever, and that's how they're controlled. And so people don't have the nuance that's necessary to make proper distinctions. And in fact, you see the same problems in what I was saying earlier about the religious sphere. People who have the Far Eastern kinds of thoughts, they want to blend everything down into an ultimate unity. And those Far Eastern worldviews, that's exactly what Huxley said would be the religion of the New World Order. In perennial philosophy, he says, everybody will be absorbed into a giant blob, and that's why we find the Far Eastern philosophy is much more useful for the promotion of collectivism. Now, when I say that doesn't mean that anarcho-individualism is the answer. It's not, because again, the dialectical tension that you're talking about also applies to the socio-political sphere in the sense of neither promoting and preferring the individual over against the collective or the collective over against the individual. That's another one in a many dialectic that can be enacted. And that's why we see the same people who run world socialism just happen to be funded by the same people that run the libertarian free market stuff.
Speaking of libertarianism, your conversation with Adam Kokesh, I thought you made his point untenable within the first 10 minutes of the debate. Right.
I think most people would agree.
Anyways, your conversations with Mark Hackard are great. He's equally stimulating in his point of view.
Mark's a super smart guy, brilliant Russia geopolitical analyst.
I think it's so fascinating, like the first whiff of the Russiagate thing that, not that I'm extremely perceptive or anything, but I was like, this sounds phony. And this is like an acceptable conspiracy theory that people have ran with. And I think it's propagated by the media endlessly, obviously. And the other thing that kind of ignited my thought on this is I was coming back from Japan and bored out of my mind, and I watched Red Sparrow.
I did a stream on that. It was pretty funny.
I usually just watch movies, and I'm not very perceptive. I don't think about the themes that are being presented to me while I'm watching the film. I could not even believe how thick it was being laid on. Like the CIA was the good people, and the Russians were the evil, horrible people. And I was like,
the CIA handler's gonna save her from her Russian gangsters who were,
I don't know, just your general thought from talking to Mark, or your own points of view about, I don't know, Zbigniew Brzezinski, didn't he think China and Russia were the last two empires that had to be toppled or something similar?
Yeah, I mean, in Grand Chessboard, he says the key to controlling the world is controlling the Eurasian heartland, particularly Afghanistan, of course, is the gateway to the Eurasian heartland. So that's the Mackinder theory of geopolitical analysis. And that's been adopted, of course, by the U.S. Imperium from the British Empire. So that's certainly still the game plan. That's the basics of geopolitics there. And that was the purpose of 1979 and Afghanistan and all that. That's not to say that the Soviets were a genuine godly force fighting the West. Both of these systems are atheistic at root, whether it's Western capitalism or Eastern socialism. But at the same time, there really are wars. There really are battles. There really are spies who, spy on one another. So the games are played out at different levels, and certainly at the top, if you listen to the really good interview that Mark and I did about Victor Rothschild, he's a great example of somebody who was playing both sides. He was playing both the KGB and the British intelligence side of things, and that was a big vindication for what a lot of people had suspected for a long time. And if you read Professor Anthony Sutton, you get the same idea with Wall Street funding the Bolsheviks and helping to build up the Soviet Empire and all this. So that's all true. And then, sometimes rulers don't always do what the West likes and they get toppled. I'm not an expert on, Russian history or Soviet history. Mark certainly knows more about all that than I do. But there is an interesting case to be made for Stalin doing some things that the Atlantists didn't like. And, we've seen people who even were puppets installed by the CIA, like Saddam, they eventually they expire like milk and they get removed. That's one of the reasons I read Miles Copeland, who was a famous CIA operative. I read his book, Game of Nations. That's part of the Globalist book series. And he describes this too. He talks about the period of time where they worked with Nasser for the purpose of game theory. They let Nasser do his stuff. And then they wanted to eventually update and revolutionize Egypt. And Copeland says in that book that the whole purpose of all that with Egypt was to bring Egypt into the modern world so that it could be globalized, so that it could be depopulated. But it took several decades and phases of this. And they had it actually worked out how to do this over many decades. Now, people like Nasser and people like, that run the governments, they're not always hip to all this. They don't know what's going on. And a lot of times these installed leaders are corrupted and compromised, and they're in it for themselves. Now, I'm not saying that means that every person who opposes the West is completely corrupt and compromised. I'm just saying that that's the reality of the real world. So I don't put any hope in any sort of political leader. I think that Putin's kind of like Trump. He does some good things and some bad things, but I don't have any hope or trust in Putin as an individual to save civilization or something like this, or that Trump's going to save us from this or that. I mean, the problems of Russia are pretty severe when it comes to Western globalist entities in Russia, like the Carnegie Foundation or any of the Fortune 100. I mean, they're all in Russia too. So I'm very aware of all that. But at the same time, Russia has built thousands of churches in the last few years. What Brzezinski talks about with destabilization, what he called the arc of crisis throughout the Eastern Bloc, there's no doubt that the last few years since the Cold War have been about making sure that there's not going to be any deviation on the part of Russia from the globalist game plan. And all that's very real. I mean, all the stuff that we've seen in the Ukraine, that's all real. What's going on in Syria, that's all very real. I don't think that China represents a real opposition to globalism. I think they're very much part of that structure. But there may be elements within China that could be seen as a potential concern. The way the globalists do this is that they'll look at these places and these areas and these countries, and it's not so much about the stuff that's happening now. They'll look at and project what could be the case 10, 20 years from now. So they're interested in making sure that 10, 20 years from now, there isn't any movement or ideology or thought process or church or anything like that that could, down the road cause deviation. In other words, we've seen, like in the last week, the apparent challenge of Soros to China, China versus Soros versus China. Again, that probably has more to do with Soros' money interests and plans for the future and who's going to be, the top dogs in the coming technocratic global system than it does anything to do with like, oh, China's going to beat the New World Order or something like that. And that's nonsense.
Your bread and butter is the predictive programming of movies and television. You just do a fantastic job going through these things. And with JayDyer, the Hollywood Decoded series, I got through most of the episodes and thought they were excellent. And
oh, great. Yeah, I'm very, very proud of that. It was probably one of the crowning achievements of my life to date. So thank you.
And you did another Michael Caine, which was great.
Now the thing with JayDyer is he's a bloody fool, and I wouldn't trust him as far as I throw him. Now when I went,
I'm joking. He's a great guy. I'm just kidding. But
now when I started talking like Michael Caine on the set, people started going crazy, and they thought he lost his mind.
No, they really weren't expecting that. And my thought was to be a little more wacky. And, when you have like a actual producer and people that are we had a 2-time Emmy-winning producer actually for the show, and the setup was it was very serious, very professional, and I wanted to be a little more goofy, but I think it came out good. I'm very pleased with what came out. I wish that we had a season 2. I think it was a little edgy. I don't think Guy really wanted to promote it too much. It was it's kind of too dark and too cerebral for the Gaia audience. But I think it's phenomenal. I think it's I'm not just bragging or I'm trying to be self-righteous, but I'm really happy with it. It came out way better than I expected, not because of Jay or anybody that worked on it. It's just that I'd seen other Gaia TV shows and I was kind of iffy on it, not knocking Gaia. It actually wasn't Gaia. It was actually Jay's company that produced the show. And then all Gaia did was just air it. They just streamed it. So they really didn't have a whole lot to do with it other than that we filmed it at one of their studios. So, but thank you. Yeah, it's predictive programming. I don't even remember how the list came up of, I think I just wrote down 23 movies that I thought would be worth analyzing. And I spent like a month writing a whole season 2, which will never be unless somebody else picks it up. But I mean, there's a whole season 2 that's written, like 150 pages or so, but oh well. That's what happens. But by the way, there is a new show, not affiliated with Gaia, a different type of show that we filmed a sizzle reel for in LA, and hopefully that will come to fruition. But I don't know, given the saturation of shows, streaming shows, there's so many shows out there that, I have no doubt that the show would be good. I had no doubt that Hollywood Decoded would be good, but the way it is with that kind of entertainment type stuff is that it's just having a good idea is not enough. Like, you got to have advertising, marketing, and all that behind you, and you've got to have the right kind of network picking it up. So there's a whole, list of factors that go into also, maybe you've got the best talent, you've got the best idea, you got a great production, but you've also got to have these other engines behind you.
I was in a band signed to Island, and we had our A&R guy got fired. And that's when we all realized we were screwed.
Yeah.
Because nobody,
you know what I mean? Yeah.
Nobody at the label, we were like a new act. Nobody cared about us. And so exactly to what you're talking about, you need many levels of people being your cheerleader and bringing things to fruition to make it in those types of industries. Right. I think it's such a simple breakdown, but I guess eyes wide shut of predictive programming. And you pointed out G.I. Joe, and even I think you mentioned in one of the interviews, Josie and the Pussycats, people being subconsciously or consciously trained to think about things in a certain way. I think that's really interesting, and obviously is a through line to all the work you do.
Well, it came about, as a result of what I was studying in grad school. One of the things about grad school is that you get a little more freedom to choose the topics that you want to study and write on. And when I was going to do my master's thesis, I wanted to do something pop culture related, because I had an old blog a long time ago, and I posted a lot of conspiracy stuff, and it got a decent audience. It got a decent amount of traction. I decided I wanted to change it up. I didn't really like the direction it was going in. And I was having some ideological shifts as well around 2008, 7, 8. Somewhere in there, I was kind of getting a little dissatisfied with the Ron Paul libertarian type of worldview. I was moving more in the traditional type of perspective that I have now today. So I didn't want to keep going in that direction with my old blog, but I was also at the same time starting to post movie analysis type stuff about 2007, 2008, because I was noticing, there are actually, conspiracy elements in movies. And I'd read a few books by some authors that had touched on this subject, and so read some analyses along these lines. So I just started blogging about it on a new blog that was going to be more so focused on movie stuff. And that ended up, like you said, kind of becoming the bread and butter. And at the same time, 2011, 12, I had chosen 007 as master's thesis. So ended up having a falling out with the advisor, and I didn't finish the master's thesis. I think it got about 1/3 done. But the idea stuck, and I thought, well, you know what? What's the point even of doing the master's thesis? Why not just write a book about this stuff? So I had it in my mind that there would eventually maybe be a book, but I just kind of kept trugging along and churning out articles. I wrote hundreds and hundreds of articles over that time span. Eventually what happened was, I think I met Mark, reached out to me, and we started chatting. I think at that time he was writing for Tacky's Mag. And then I met Patrick, I think, because Patrick had Mark on, and then that's how I met Patrick. So I started going on 21 Wire with Patrick, and Patrick knew, Sean Stone, and he knew Corbett. I think they had done an interview at one time. And then kind of through that means I got connected with a lot of people like Syrian Girl and And I did an interview with Corbett as well. Maybe we did two or three. I can't remember. But yeah, just kind of, you start meeting people and you start doing interviews and people start catching on. And then what ended up helping me a lot was Buzzsaw with Sean Stone. And that's how I think Jay Widener saw that. And I think my publisher saw the Buzzstone, or excuse me, Buzzstone, Sean Buzzstone. My publisher saw the Sean Stone interview because he had just gotten Sean to do a book, and then he emailed me and said, "Do you have a book?" And I said, "Well, yeah," but I didn't. I had just all these movie analyses, so I was like, "I'll just stick all the movie analyses into it." And it worked, right? It worked out really good. I think Jay Widener reached out to me after that, and he said, "Hey, are you going to be at this?" I had gotten invited to speak at an event in 2015 in Texas, the Secret Space Program, and my lecture was on predictive programming in film and science fiction and stuff. So I got to meet quite a few people through that, and yeah, it just kind of snowballed. Like it snowballed into meeting this person, and people reaching out, just sending emails, basically. That led to the book, and then that led to the TV show, and now there is the second book. And I'm very proud of that one. I think it's actually a better written book. Your first book's, kind of your crowning achievement. You're very proud of that. But I think the second one is a better written book. It's funnier. It's better prose, better writing, and it's longer. So it actually covers more stuff. But yeah, so I started in the first one, like you said, for those that aren't familiar, it's basically 363 pages, 404 footnotes about big directors. So I took on Kubrick in the first 100 pages, Eyes Wide Shut, Shining. And then I took on H.G. Wells and Spielberg in the next section. I talked about AI and I talked about E.T. And then I took on Hitchcock and 007 in the next section and David Lynch. And then the last section was kind of a just CIA and Hollywood overall chapter.
You said something in one of the interviews, directors have directors. And I thought that was a good way of explaining it. Can you maybe encapsulate the connection of the CIA and Hollywood?
Well, there's a whole lot of layers and levels to this as well. So, it's not like everything is completely controlled. But yeah, I mean, there's a liaison offices between, the intelligence agencies and different studios in Hollywood. And that's kind of well known now. It's been going on for a long time. And then, a lot of famous actors have been spies. So that's another layer and level to this in the history of cinema and theater as well. You can go all the way back to the Elizabethan era, and you had actors and actresses who were, or I get actors, I don't think you had actresses yet, but they were spies. So this has gone on for a long time. And I think, a lot of people aren't aware of that if you haven't kind of studied those specific topics in college, in university. I did. So it was more and more obvious to me that was the case. And I just decided, well, that makes for such an interesting topic that not many people have written on. There's a handful of books that are on this. And 2 or 3 of them are written mainly for academics. They're not really written for mass reading, mass consumption. So one of the challenges in my book was to try to maintain both an easy readable type of book, but that was also academic. That was also goofy and fun at the same time. So it's a weird mix. It's not any book like it really. I'm not bragging. I think I'm stating a fact, because most books conform to a specific set genre. They're either academic or they're pop or they're whatever. This is not any of those. It's a very unique, weird cultural commentary, I guess is the best way to put it, what it is.
Frances Stoner Saunders, in one of her talks, she says the CIA is treating the culture as like a bonsai tree or something, and they're supporting branches they want to grow. Is that something like Hollywood? Scripts that serve the oligarchy will be made, and ones that don't will be made less often or not at all?
Sure. Scripts can be changed to put certain narratives and plot lines in, or cultural messages or propaganda messages, or there's a lot of different interests that could be involved. It could be the CIA, it could be corporate interest in a certain film, or a lot of different things. The Fortune 100 and the big banks and the CIA and Hollywood, they're pretty well intertwined. There's not a big, in the Pentagon, there's not a big distinction, but because it's a revolving door, a lot of the people who will go from one will go to the other, right? Angelina Jolie goes from Hollywood to the CFR. There's no better example than that.
And didn't Ben Affleck say that Hollywood was filled with CIA agents?
Sure. Yeah, he's probably one of them.
Last question, and again, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. Maybe it was an interview on Red Ice, which all the ones I've seen were pretty awesome. But you guys talked about mass trauma and just the news and just so many elements of culture just being this just snowball of trauma.
Well, there was a lot of studies done of trauma, by Tavistock and by the CIA and by military intelligence over the last century. And they pretty well perfected the technique of how to traumatize people, I would say. And even things like Hitchcock films were studied on the basis of how they might traumatize the audience. I think there were studies done on Psycho in that regard. I think that's in my first book. But they know that cinema has the ability to do that. In fact, in my new book, my second book, I talked about how that was shown in Clockwork Orange, if you remember the scenes where they essentially traumatize Alex to put him in a catatonic state. And that's really what behavioral operant conditioning, behavioral modification, Skinner, Pavlov, that's all about. So that pops up in a lot of films, and I talk about how films have shown us that very thing. And that's what mass media and mass ritual trauma, things like, big events, I won't name them, but big events, that's what they are designed to do, right? I'm trying to avoid the algorithm god, right? That's what they're designed to do, is essentially cause that kind of dissociative, catatonic, apathetic state in the population to make them more suggestible, more manageable. It's all, once you kind of key into it, it kind of makes sense. So, of course, that's what they want to do, right?
And just to leave on a positive note, you mentioned a few times that you don't see it going their way. And one of the ways to tear the agenda down is basically to make fun of it, which is what you do pretty well.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I've always been somewhat goofy and comedic, and initially I wanted to be a comedian before I realized that you have to kind of be in the system's cult to get anywhere in entertainment, right? So, but I never would have dreamed there would be a way, to basically wear all the hats at once, which is, I guess, the blessing that we have with the internet right now, is that I can kind of be the whole person of me that I am, not just the guy interested in theology and philosophy, or not just the guy into geopolitics, or not just the guy into movies, and also being ridiculous and doing impressions and acting like an idiot. I could do all those things at once. I could be an idiot theologian, analyst all at once.
Cool, man. I mean, we talked about it, but jaysanalysis.com, where we can find you, your Twitter, Esoteric Hollywood, Hollywood Decoded, your books, what's the best way to buy them, etc.
Yeah, please buy them at the shop at my website. I offer signed copies. It's a little bit more than Amazon, but Amazon's not the best for authors. So if you go to jaysanalysis.com, you'll see the shop link there. And then you can also subscribe to my site, where you get access to talks, lectures, like the full talks. Most of the time I do half free, half subscription. And there's entire courses, entire lectures on Plato's Republic, on Tragedy and Hope, globalist books that we've been talking about. There's dozens of interviews, and it's a pretty big archive, about, I think, 3 years worth of an archive now of stuff there. That's mainly, kind of a learning tool is what it really functions as. I also do tutoring. I tutor people if they want to sign up for tutoring. I do that about once a week with different people in different topics. Philosophy, geopolitics, whatever. There is, the TV show is, so there's links at the website to the TV show at Gaia. I don't own that or control that, so that's a separate thing from me. But if people want to watch the show, I would encourage that if they want to subscribe to Gaia to do that. And then the book, to Esoteric Hollywood 1 and 2 at my site, and subscription, and that's all I can think of. And then there's links at the website too. My YouTube channel, it's grown quite a bit the last year. So, be sure and subscribe on as many of the outlets as you can, because of course, we never know when the outlets might go away.
Just some of your favorite debates, like the JF debate, the Robert Taylor debate. I've gotten a lot out of those. Is there any other ones you think that are specifically good?
I kind of view them all the same, because I feel like I'm always debating the same, the same position. It's always the same opponent with some variation on the same argument. So it's like, I guess the Robert Taylor debate, one of them was atheism. Actually, two of them, I guess, were. And then the one was economics. So did you see the Robert Taylor economics? That one's pretty funny.
I saw one where you guys just had a conversation and he was under the impression it wasn't a debate. And then I saw another one where it was more of a debate and he was more antagonistic.
Well, we've had 3 debates. So we had one on atheism. And then the next one was Warski Live, atheism. And then the next one was whether capitalism had connections to Freemasonry and was materialistic. And that was on the Chadcast. So we've had 3 official debates, and they've all been fun. I mean, every debate I've had has been a blast. I can't think of anyone that I didn't enjoy. And they all kind of have their own, unique peculiarities. The Jim Goad one was kind of in tongue in cheek. It wasn't a real debate. But probably, I think probably the best one is probably the JF debate. I mean, that's definitely the one that everybody, remembers. Everybody mentions it to me. It's kind of the perennial debate. I doubt that, unless I grow to be to some big enough level that I could debate somebody like Stefan Molyneux, I don't think there's going to be any, there's not going to be any debate anytime soon that will be remembered like the JF debate.
Just out of curiosity, where would have that vegan debate have gone if you had got past that stumbling block?
In the same spot as all the other debates.
But I'm not anti-animal. I think animal products are great. But if somebody were to ask me, I'd be like, well, I don't know how a person can be healthy if they don't incorporate some level of animal products. But because I'm just...
Well, I think this is an interesting point, though, about, because it ties into a lot of what I've been arguing the last year, is the rise of this vegan issue, because it's a tough one for the people in the libertarian anarcho crowd, because they base their ideology on so-called natural law theory. And guess what? So do all the vegans, because they're trying to be more consistent with the non-aggression principle and say, well, if NAP is true from, quote, nature, then we shouldn't eat animals. Oh, wait a minute. But in nature, animals eat animals. There's dominance hierarchies everywhere, apex predators, blah, blah, blah. That's how we evolved. So there's no clear way to adjudicate between the vegan or the carnivore or the cannibal position for all that, for that matter. And you say, oh, but what about which one's more healthy? Well, what does that mean exactly, to be more healthy? Maybe there's no reason that I should accept what is more healthy for me. Maybe it's ideal for me to have the this gets into the problems, for example, of utilitarianism. For example, I might say, oh, well, I want to actually just enjoy a year of eating all of my enemies, and at the end of that year, stand on a pile of a pyramid of skulls. And, maybe I'll go out in a blaze of glory. I'll, be on top of an Aztec pyramid, and I'll, open up a grenade or something. And maybe, but see, this is the problem with utilitarianism, is that maybe the degree of joy that I get from that year of doing that, maybe that is greater than the degree of pleasure that I would get from a year of living a healthy carnivore or vegan lifestyle. You see what I'm saying? There's no way to judge which of those options. This is a classic critique of utilitarianism, which, by the way, most libertarian and classical economic theory is intimately tied up with Bentham and libertarianism, or utilitarianism, excuse me. This completely destroys that view. Because you have no way to know whether it's quantitative or qualitative, quote, pleasure or wellness, or whatever terms you want to use. There's no way to know which one is better or that you should choose. If I have a society where people are afraid that there's a serial killer running loose, and I decide as the magistrate, or as let's say we're a libertarian society, and I am the head of the collective private security force that we've all voluntarily accepted, and I decide with my friends that it's best for society to pick an innocent person, to put him on trial and get rid of him, so that the collective society's fear of the serial killer is allayed. How do I know which one is the better choice here? Because on the one hand, maybe it's better to soothe the fears of everybody that Jeffrey Dahmer's running around and let one guy go. Or is it better to protect that one guy and let the whole society maybe fall apart from, mass panic due to serial killers? You see what I'm saying? Like, this is a classic problem in utilitarianism. And when you realize that utilitarianism got so absurd that it reached the point where its philosophers were literally trying to come up with a moral calculus to find out through mathematical principles what the appropriate pleasure numbers are in pleasure principle. I'm not joking. That's how absurd that got. You see that this completely falls apart. Why? Because it's all based on the exact same presuppositions of atheism and materialism as all of its opponents are. They all collapse into the opposite of one another, and they all fall apart.
But you would approach it from a biblical standpoint.
There's no other way. Yeah. I mean, if you could make an argument outside of the biblical perspective, I mean, I'm not saying that it wouldn't be practically useful, but ultimately the problem is that the questions immediately fall back on ultimate presuppositions and ultimate faith commitments. So there's no way to avoid it, because we're immediately talking about ethics and what's right and how we know and view the external world and the natural world. So in my worldview, there's nothing wrong with eating animals because God has allowed that given the fall. In my worldview, you can't properly interpret the world unless you understand the fall. So I just did a talk, for example, on some Darwinian theories and ideologies. And one of the reasons that Darwinism became so prominent in the Victorian period was because the theologians of the Victorian period, the Church of England particularly, had given up the idea that creation was a revealed doctrine. And so in other words, when they tried to interpret the natural world, they said, well, this is made by a monster because this world has predators and prey. How could that be a good God? This world has mutants, and it has, guys that are born with, male parts and female parts, and, babies die, and all. This is not the work of a benevolent creator, but of some kind of Gnostic demiurge or something. So you can actually find quotes in Darwin where it literally sounds like the Gnostics. So point being is that from our vantage point, you can't actually accurately interpret the natural world unless you believe in the fall, because the fall is why the world is how it is in our worldview, in our theology. So in other words, yes, eating animals is fine because that's what's happened as a result of the fall and the way God has set up things after the fall. You see what I'm saying? Now, I'm not saying that proves my position. I'm just saying that shows that I can't interpret the world properly. It's just consistently from my worldview, from my vantage point, without taking those things into account. Otherwise, it won't make any sense. So in other words, yes, I have to immediately, to be consistent with my view, I have to immediately fall back on how my ultimate faith commitments, namely revelation in Scripture, how it interprets the natural world.
But you can source back to a biblical perspective, but there's no way to further that argument and say, well, protein is needed by the liver to store glucose to protect from cortisol.
Oh, no, that's what I was trying to say a minute ago when I was saying that one could make it just a health-based argument. That's fine. Mm-hmm. Sure.
Okay.
No, I'm not saying that you can't do that. What I'm saying is that eventually what happens in the discourse or debate with somebody who's, say, a vegan, is that they'll start getting to the point where you'll get to the point where you're asking the question of, well, how do you even know what right and wrong is? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right. And at that point is when it starts to verge on the kind of presuppositional, God's existence questions. I'm not at all saying that you can't do what you're talking about. I mean, in ways that's analogous to doing evidence-based apologetics. It wouldn't be wrong for me to say to an atheist, look at the structure of an earthworm. It shows that it's been designed. But I'm not going to make that argument to an atheist without putting it in context of saying that there's no such thing as a notion of design that operates autonomously apart from my theology holistically. I don't know, does that make sense, or is that a little obtuse?
With all your stuff, it's like my favorite records, and I need to take a few spins with it. Mm-hmm. But I mean, that's why you were appealing, because you were saying some things that were resonating and other things that were new to me or that I had never heard. I listened to an interview with Vox Day last night, and mm-hmm. the interviewer was